several months in 1984, Günter Stoll had been telling his wife that people were after him. He never identified them, offered no names, and described no specific threat. He referred only to a group he called they, as if their identity was already obvious. Günter was 34 and lived with his wife Evelyn in Anshausen, a small village in West Germany. He had trained as a food technologist but was unemployed, and the pressure on the family had been growing. Evelyn could see that his anxiety was becoming more intense, yet nothing he told her explained where it had come from. There had been no confrontation she knew about, no threatening letter, and no person she could contact on his behalf. On the evening of 25th October, Günter was at home with Evelyn when his behavior changed. He had been sitting quietly, apparently lost in thought, when he suddenly announced that something had finally become clear to him. Whatever conclusion he had reached seemed urgent enough that he immediately looked for something to write on. Günter pulled a small piece of paper towards him and wrote down a short sequence of characters. Before Evelyn had a chance to ask what they meant, he drew a line through them and discarded the paper. He offered no explanation, and the moment passed almost as quickly as it had begun. Evelyn later remembered the sequence as YOG'TZE, although the original note was never preserved or examined by the police. At the time, she had no reason to think it mattered. It looked like an abandoned thought, written down and rejected almost immediately. Not long afterwards, Günter left the house. There was no argument and no dramatic goodbye. He simply went out into the night. Whatever he believed he had understood remained unspoken, and Evelyn could not have known that the crossed-out characters would eventually give his case its name. Günter drove to Wilnsdorf, a nearby town where he sometimes visited a pub called the Papillon. He ordered a beer, but before he had settled in, he suddenly fell backwards from his bar stool and struck his face. The people around him helped him up and found him conscious, though shaken. According to the later reconstruction of the evening, he told those nearby that he had briefly blacked out. He could have remained at a pub, called Evelyn, or asked someone to take him home. Instead, he left after only a short time and returned to his Volkswagen. For roughly the next 2 hours, there was no reliable account of where he went. The distance between the Papillon and his next confirmed location was short, yet the journey took far longer than it should have. Whether Günter drove without a destination, stopped somewhere along the way, or met anyone during that period was never established. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, Günter appeared in Heigerselbach, the village where he had grown up. His parents lived nearby, but he did not go to their house. Instead, he stopped at the home of an older woman who had known him since childhood and called up to her from outside. She spoke to him from an upstairs window. Günter wanted to come inside and talk, but the late hour and his unsettled manner made her reluctant to let him in. During the brief exchange, he warned that something terrible was going to happen that night. The woman suggested that he speak to his parents, whose home was only a short distance away. Günter refused, saying they would not understand. When she advised him to return to Evelyn instead, he appeared to accept the suggestion and walked back towards his car. He did not drive home. Roughly 2 hours later, his Volkswagen would be found near Hagen, close to 100 kilometers away. What happened between Heigerselbach and the motorway remained the largest blank space in the original timeline. At around 3 in the morning, 2 lorry drivers traveling on the A45 near the Hagen-Süd junction noticed a badly damaged Volkswagen down the embankment beside the road. As they passed, they believed they saw someone moving near the vehicle. They stopped and returned to check whether help was needed. By the time they reached the wreck, no one was standing outside. Günter was lying naked and critically injured on the passenger side of his own car. He was still conscious enough to respond to a few questions, although his condition made the exchange brief and uncertain. When the drivers asked whether anyone else had been with him, Günter reportedly said that 4 men had been in the car and had already left. When asked whether they were his friends, he said they were not. No other person was found along the roadside, and the drivers could not identify the figure they thought they had seen near the Volkswagen. Emergency services were called, but Günter's injuries were too severe. He died shortly afterwards, before he could explain where he had been, why he was undressed, or what he meant by the 4 men. The damage to his Volkswagen initially appeared capable of explaining what had happened. The car had left the motorway, traveled down the embankment, and struck a tree. An early accident assessment, however, reached a very different conclusion. The expert examining the case believed that Günter's injury did not come from the crash beside the A45. Instead, he appeared to have been struck or run over by another vehicle somewhere else. In that scenario, Günter had been placed inside his own Volkswagen before he was driven to the motorway and sent down the embankment. This was not a minor detail. It transformed a fatal road accident into a possible homicide and created an unknown first scene somewhere between Heigerzelbach and Hagen. The severe injury to Günter's arm, which was almost torn away, seemed to support the idea that his body had been subjected to forces beyond those produced inside the Volkswagen. If the reconstruction was correct, another person had to be involved. Someone had driven the car, someone had moved Günter into the passenger area, and someone had left the scene before the lorry drivers returned. The 4 men he mentioned were no longer a confusing final statement. They became potential suspects in the murder investigation. Police began searching for the place where Günter might first have been injured and for the people who could have transported him to the motorway. His wife was questioned repeatedly, and investigators examined suggestions that he had connections to organized crime or the drug trade, including contacts he may have made during visits to the Netherlands. None of those inquiries produced a confirmed link to his death. Reports of a hitchhiker seen near Hagensoot Junction were investigated, as was the person the lorry drivers had noticed near the Volkswagen, yet neither could be reliably identified or connected to Günter. No second vehicle was found with damage that matched the original theory, and no location was discovered where he could be shown to have been struck. The 4 men remained central because the entire homicide theory seemed to require other people. At the same time, their existence rested on a few words spoken by a critically injured man in the final minutes of his life. There was no description of them, no name, no confirmed sighting, and no physical evidence that placed 4 additional occupants inside the car. The investigation therefore faced a difficult contradiction. Its reconstruction implied that someone else had to be involved, but every attempt to find that person or any trace of a wider group Günter described ended without an answer. In 1985, the case was presented on Antinziken XY, Ungelast, Germany's best-known television program for unsolved crimes. The broadcast introduced a national audience to the unexplained journey, the 4 men, and the strange sequence Evelyn remembered from the discarded note. Hundreds of tips followed. Many viewers focused on Yakshi, convinced that the characters might identify a person, a place, or a criminal organization. Investigators considered the information they received, but the public attention did not produce the missing crime scene, a suspect, or a verifiable meaning for the note. As the years passed, the investigation slowed. The original reconstruction remained the foundation of the case, yet the evidence needed to complete it never appeared. No witness could account for the missing hours, no vehicle could be tied to the alleged first collision, and no one came forward who could explain why Günter had traveled so far from home. Without a solution, the case gradually moved beyond the police file and into the public imagination. It was no longer remembered simply as the unexplained death of a man on the motorway. It became one of Germany's most enduring mysteries, a story whose most famous clue had never been seen by the investigators trying to solve it. Once the official investigation reached a dead end, other people began trying to make the pieces fit. Theories grew around the parts of the story that seemed most unusual, especially the note and Günter's reference to 4 men. Some believed he had become involved with organized criminals and was killed before he could reveal what they knew. The suggestion of contacts in the Netherlands encouraged stories about drug trafficking and cross-border smuggling, although investigators never established that Günter belonged to, worked with, or had threatened any such group. Others concentrated on the characters themselves, because the original paper was gone. Even the transcription was uncertain. If the letter G had actually been the number 6, some radio enthusiasts argued that YOG'TZE resembled a call sign, sequenced as the vehicle registration, an industrial abbreviation, a product code, or an unfinished anagram. Each possibility offered the impression of a solution, but none could be connected to a confirmed event from Günter's final night. The case endured because every theory could explain one fragment whilst leaving the others untouched. A final criminal conspiracy might account for Günter's fear, but not the absence of evidence. A code might give meaning to the note, but not explain the missing clothes, the route to Hagen, or the crash. The 4 men might support the murder theory, but no one could establish who they were or whether Günter's final words had been understood correctly. For almost 40 years, the basic version of the story remained unchanged. Günter had been attacked somewhere else, transported in his own car, and left beside the motorway by people who were never identified. Then, in 2024, an investigator returned to the original files and began questioning the assumption on which the entire story depended. The review was led by Meg Schmidt, an investigator with Hagen Police. Rather than searching immediately for a new suspect, she reorganized the old material, compared the surviving records, and examined the points where the accepted version of events relied on interpretation than on direct evidence. One of those points was the claim that Günter had been run over. The original accident expert had been confident that the injuries came from another vehicle at another location, yet the forensic medical report had never independently tested that sequence in detail. If the initial accident interpretation was wrong, then the second crime scene, the unknown driver, and much of the murder investigation could all have been built around an event that had not occurred. Schmidt also returned to the statements from the lorry drivers. Through years of retelling, the figure they saw near the Volkswagen has sometimes become a man fleeing into the woods. The original record did not say that. The driver had seen someone at the car as they passed, but he had not witnessed that person escaping from the scene. A new accident reconstruction was commissioned. The expert calculated the movement of the Volkswagen after it left the motorway and examined what could have happened to the body of an unrestrained occupant as the car traveled through the embankment and struck a tree. Smith then took those findings back to the forensic specialist and asked them to reconsider whether the crash itself could have produced Günter's injuries. For the first time, the case was being tested without assuming in advance that a murder had taken place. The question was no longer who attacked Günter and driven his car to Hagen. It was whether the physical evidence required another person at all. The new analysis produced a very different account of the crash. Investigators concluded that Günter had been run over by another vehicle. The severe injuries, including the damage to his arm, could be explained by the forces created when his Volkswagen left the motorway, traveled down an embankment, and struck a tree. Günter had been wearing a seatbelt. During the collision, his body could have been thrown across the interior, which explained why he was found in the passenger side, even if he had been driving. The person seen moving near the car could have been Günter himself in a period after the impact, rather than an unidentified attacker leaving the scene. The review found no trace or witness evidence that ultimately confirmed outside involvement. Once the injuries were attributed to the motorway crash, there was no longer a need for a second collision, a second crime scene, or another driver. The original structure of the murder theory began to fall away. In April 2025, Hagen Police and the public prosecutor announced that they no longer considered Günter's death a homicide. Their conclusion was that he had left the road without braking and crashed without the involvement of another person. They also said that he had suffered from depression and was very likely experiencing a serious psychological crisis, which could explain both his behavior that evening and the fact that he was undressed. The announcement closed the investigation after more than 40 years. It explained how Günter received injuries that killed him, but did not turn every uncertain detail into a known fact. The police could reconstruct the collision, they could not reconstruct every thought or decision that brought him to that point. The missing hours remained largely unaccounted for. No one knows exactly where Günter went after leaving the Papillon, why he drove towards Hagen rather than returning to Anhausen, or what he was trying to communicate when he visited the woman in Hagersillbach. His statement about 4 men may have been literal, confused, misunderstood, or connected to his mental state, but the surviving evidence cannot establish which. Then there was the note. The original paper was never seen by police, and a second sheet on which Evelyn later reproduced the characters was also lost. That means the exact sequence cannot be independently confirmed, and no interpretation of YOG'TZE can be tested against the object itself. For decades, the note was treated as though it might unlock the entire case. The modern investigation reached a more limited conclusion. Whatever the characters meant to Günter, they were not relevant to the physical cause of his death. Their personal meaning, if they had one, disappeared with him. Late on the evening of 25th October 1984, Günter Stoll told his wife that something had finally become clear to him. He wrote a few characters on a piece of paper, crossed them out, and left the house. 40 years later, investigators believe they understand how he died. What no one will ever know is what Günter believed he had finally understood.